7th century Medina and the state that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, tried to establish, and also taking inspiration from the Caliphate of Ali alayhi salam in the same period, are just some of the examples which Muslims around the world can turn to make a comparison to where we are today in the 21st century. Now, COVID-19 and the world beyond COVID-19, after COVID-19, if there can be an after COVID-19, because it's not clear whether this virus will just keep coming and coming. That's unclear. But whichever way it is, what it's done is made us all obviously think and question our existence. Many people have gone into a spiritual, esoteric sort of itikaf almost, self-isolation. What else is this? Kind of time to yourself, and you start thinking and reflecting and pondering, which is something which the Holy Quran certainly tells us to do a lot of. I wonder how much people have been thinking and pondering and reflecting, or whether they've just been getting more demoralized and fearing. No doubt there are positives and negatives that have emerged. Animals are probably happier. Probably Mother Nature in general is cleaner in terms of the pollution side of it. I can also see that, as Clive was saying earlier in our conversation prior to the show, that actually we as families and as individuals are beginning to value each other perhaps more, and even maybe connect more. Modern technology has facilitated some good. People have been able to connect over Zoom and all sorts of other paraphernalia, which people are getting used to. But is this all part of a vision which the establishment or the structural elite, who traditionally controlled the money supplies, controlled our commons, controlled society as a whole for their own, primarily their own profit making, arguably? Or is it something we can participate in? Are people, the citizenry, just victims of COVID-19 after its arrival? Or are we going to be active participants in shaping the world that is to come? Or is that something just for the industrial military complex, the governments, the money lender institutions, and the powers that be? Are we going to be participants in shaping the new world? Because a lot of what was in the old world, if we can call it that, it's not so long ago, is it? Wasn't very pleasant. I mean, the famines that were happening in Yemen, the war that was going on against Yemen by the Saudis, funded by us as Britain, US, it was going on. It's still going on. It's still going to be there after COVID-19 has maybe passed out in this phase. Many other tragedies, many other failures of human civilization are very apparent, which we discussed in our other program. Well, without any further ado, I'd like to bring back into the discussion Clive Menzies and Maulana Syed Muhammad Razavi. Welcome, gentlemen.
Good evening again.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm going to start with you again, Clive, to kick things off, focusing on what sort of world we should be shaping and whether we are in a position to do that. Because, of course, we've talked about hierarchy and the corruption within structural elitism, the corruption that exists in terms of the ownership of all the assets, the commons, as you often describe it, the asset of humanity on the planet, the mines, the rivers, the knowledge capital, all these aspects, which is wealth in one form or another, that humans have access to. And of course, we've also talked about usury and the exploitation of the masses based on the economic system of usury, which basically keeps the poor poorer and the rich richer. Bezos and Bill Gates and the like, the multi-zillionaires or billionaires, have got richer because of COVID-19, and all the indications are that they will get even richer. So this wealth equality is certainly not something that in my crystal ball looks like it's going to be resolved by our establishments and our elites. What is it in terms of your vision that could offer some sort of plan of action to ordinary citizenry to actually take hold of their future, rather than just cowing to a future shaped by men in suits that order you to do things on behalf of other very rich men in suits?
Well, it's not so much my vision as the vision or the reality that is emerging. We've just produced another paper which we've published called The End of the Age of Plunder. And we were looking at the very sort of broad range of history, that our whole economy is built on the idea of plunder. You know, whether you look at the Roman Empire, which basically plundered its way across the known world in its time before its demise. The British Empire was not dissimilar. The US has acted very similarly. And whilst US hegemony may be coming to an end, you've got Israel and China that are seeking to, perhaps, they have some imperial ambition, perhaps. But the bigger story is that the whole idea and the whole infrastructure of plunder is under threat. And recognizing that most of the levers of power are controlled by money, and what we have is centralized control of money, then what is happening in quite a widespread way, as very much part of the establishment is the decentralized finance, you know, with ideas like Bitcoin, the blockchain, and many other ideas. And there seem to be countervailing forces. So on the one hand, you have the agenda, which is to centralize all power and control everything, which is what the few who control the current levers are heading for. But in the other direction, in the unleashing of the internet and the sort of communications that we have, and to be able to discussions like this, is releasing a whole new open source way of thinking that is actually, through people trying to make money out of Bitcoin and Ethereum and all these other decent cryptocurrencies, there are actually powerful forces for decentralization. Because the biggest problem that most people face in the world, and this is where the inequality comes from, is that those that need access to money find it the most difficult to get hold of, and very rare or relatively few of them get sufficient for all this. Whereas there is a move towards producing multiple currencies, people producing their own currencies, which then give them access to economic participation. And this is a change that could occur in quite fast order and in quite dramatic fashion, because if there was the will to understand why this is happening, then people would gravitate towards it, because there are so many opportunities it would unleash. Because today's economic paradigm, and COVID is just a symptom, as you said earlier, today's economic paradigm, irrespective of whether it's by design or evolution, is irrelevant. What it does is that it creates this phenomenon of scarcity and conflict and competition. And that is not a product of human nature, that's a product of the political and economic system. Whereas if we decentralize money and everybody has access to the money they need, then there is no need for any sort of hierarchical control or the need to come up with rules and regulations, because people will optimize relationships between them, within communities and between communities. And technology gives us the ability to do that globally, but in ways that suit particular circumstances, geographical regions, you know, religious affiliation, whatever it may be. And I'd just like to say, after the closing remarks of the last conversation about China and the like, what is frustrating for me as an observer is to see countries like Iran, China, and Venezuela clearly see through so much of the deceit and lies, and yet they will come to heel on climate change, COVID, etc., regarding those as existential threats. And as long as they maintain that narrative, they weaken their own position to be a force for opposition.
A very good point. I was going to come to this exact point, so you took the words out of my mouth. Agenda 2030, with the UN Agenda 2030, that some call it Agenda 21, I think, and there are various names given to it. But there's a general sense that the UN and world bodies have been moving towards creating a particular future. And now that you've mentioned it, the rebel groups, I mean, of course, the resistance front, I could talk about the Lebanese resistance, the Syrian resistance, with Assad, the Iranian resistance, the Iraqi resistance. There's an entire swathe of resistance there in West Asia. Certainly, Russia and China, as you've mentioned, also could be regarded as a form of resistance to, say, Western or imperialism or moneylender imperialism as we know it. But there's also Cuba and Venezuela who've been under similar things. So actually, there's a real host of countries that have been sanctioned to death, and have almost been forced into creating lifestyle changes. And I'm going to come on to Maulana because he's very familiar with the Islamic Republic of Iran. And let's take that as an example, because all of these other nations also have similar issues of how to deal with imperialist moneylenders, sort of exploitation, wealth gaps, all of the things that we worry about in terms of equity and justice in this world. Maulana, the Islamic Republic of Iran, over 40 years, has been at war or been put under a state of, if you like, war by Israeli, Zionist, American strategy. Western governments generally have tried to bring the nation down in every way, shape, and form. But Clive makes a good point that it seems quite often that the vision of even these kind of revolutionary forces or movements seems to always be one of caution. For instance, within the Islamic rules and regulations and laws, it's very clear there should be no usury. The entire world system runs on usury. I get that. As an alim, and as somebody who might know the mindset of, say, Ayatollah Khamenei, is there a clash between the kind of neoliberal people within those nations, those revolutionary countries who are still trying to keep us within the World Bank, keep us within the moneylender system, not move too much from the way things are done? And then is there another group that wants to go towards creating an alternative, rather like Clive's kind of hinting at, one which does away with all these kind of enslavements? Is there a fear of going that way, and would those nations just collapse if they tried to make their own economic systems? I mean, Iran's having to do it anyway. They've blocked off the oil. They've blocked off all sorts of trade. They've been doing medical terrorism upon them. And Iran has started to mine its own mines. It's started to build its own scientific, technological capabilities, launching aerospace satellites, building their own military, missiles. They can now, they've extended their agriculture and their self-sufficiency food-wise. Has that been an active policy, or has that been forced by the way, if you like, the established moneylender system has made them go? Because if it's a forced action, then surely from an Islamic point of view, we ought to be thinking about what is optimal for civilization and society, not compromising at any level with the system. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, in Islamic Republic of Iran, there are two thoughts or two ideas working side by side. There are scholars who think that should just get on with the international rules and so-called rules and regulations and come along with them. And but the problem is, whenever during the last 40 years, whenever Iran tried that way, it has lost more. And there is also a mentality or a way of thinking in Iran which believes that these sanctions and difficulties are a lesson to push us in the direction of becoming self-sufficient, and we should not depend on international currencies. We should depend on our own people. We should depend on our own resources, and we should depend on our own friendly countries around the world. The recent barter oil with Venezuela is, and I think this will set an example and give encouragement to all other nations that if Iran can do it, others can do it as well.
Okay, Maulana, I'm going to allow you to extend this a little further, because let me give one example. With COVID-19, I'd be terribly worried about trusting a vaccination that Bill Gates offered me, or the WHO, or Big Pharma who are involved with them. I'd be totally worried about having a vaccine which was coming from these guys. I'd be less worried if it was an independent morally, ethically Islamic, if you like, based vaccine, which was cleared by people who've got some sort of moral code where they wouldn't vaccinate us with something which is going to become a control element or hurt us or injure us or have a double side effect of some kind. You see, that's where I'm coming to. Even on the issue of COVID, whatever Iran comes up with within its medical world, if they copy and paste what Bill Gates says or what these guys say, that to me would be hugely problematic because we're not providing an alternative to what we know is a corrupt, dangerous set of institutions. Another example.
And somebody is against that.
In terms, sure. So there is that awareness within that sort of the controlling structure there that we can't just copy and paste what the West is doing. But let me come on to, yeah, please.
It's against Islam because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created us with freedom of choice. Freedom of choice does not mean that we should be treated as robots and with this kind of so-called micro, nanotechnology. We control human beings is not right. I mean, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the supreme creator. If he wanted human beings to be created format, he would have created us from the beginning. And God has not created that format that we controlling power in someone else's hand, then we should be left the way Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created us of choice. I mean, everybody should have the freedom to decide. And if if they choose to go the wrong way, then they will face the consequences. Like Ibn Muljim, he killed Imam Ali ibn Talib, the choice of not killing him, Ali Talib, but he killed. So this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, God has created us, and this is how it should be.
Well, I'm going to just sort of maybe add to that and maybe let you respond as well, because it's very important. If we are saying we're trying to create an optimal society, and an Islamic revolution and an Islamic society must take into account the fact that had the Prophet been here, he would not really have gone for GMO foods and corrupting natural orders. I would have thought the Ulema certainly would have backed that. I should have thought that, for instance, the idea of polluting the earth with fertilizers, which are sort of harmful, ought to be questioned. Arguably, even the way we produce our food and the way we treat our cattle and our animals and whatnot, these are things which, from the prophetic point of view, weren't things that we should do. And, post-COVID, will we still continue doing that? There are other issues, for instance, like, the environment itself, the balance of the environment and how we use our environment. And of course, what Clive has raised is the economic system. So there's a whole range of, if you like, visionary alternative ways that a society or a nation that should run. That ideally we should see the Islamic Republic of Iran, if you like, projecting and manifesting so that others can look towards it and say, oh, is that what an Islamic society is? That's actually covering all those things which are true justice. So it's not just freedom and liberation and justice in terms of getting rid of Zionists or imperialists from the area, but it's actually also modeling a new way of, if you like, existing, which actually I would have thought that, some of the people, the very wealthy that I've seen within Iran, they would probably hate the idea, wouldn't want to live in a society like that at all. But I know that Sayyid Khamenei and certainly the Urafa, they live like that. But whether a society wants to go that way of living a much more sort of, if you like, treading on this planet lightly style of life is another thing altogether. Whether the Islamic government would even get any support from the majority for going fully in that direction is questionable. Clive, we've kicked around some of the ideas of practically talking about, even within those nations which are resistance nations, if you like, against imperialism. Any follow-up thoughts from what we were saying first?
Yeah, I do struggle with the idea of trying to put together solutions when the fundamental nature of the problem is not properly understood. And the reason that I raised both COVID-19 and climate change as examples of weakness on behalf of these opponents, and it's not just countries, there are many in the alternative sphere who are as frightened as the mainstream of this COVID virus pandemic, which has been manufactured. And the thing is, until countries like Iran and Cuba and Venezuela actually call out the lies on climate change and COVID, because they're both complete fabrications in terms of the existential threat that they pose, then once they, if they were to adhere to that narrative, then they would begin to get some traction, because they'd be dealing in truth rather than having compromised themselves on lies. And the real point is that structural change, or the solution that will emerge from what is happening, is actually down to individuals themselves having a desire and the motivation and the wherewithal to actually co-create an understanding amongst themselves, within their peer groups, but also with those that with whom they disagree. Because once we look at things from many different angles and many different viewpoints, we can see the territory that we're talking about, and we can come to some agreement that actually what reality is. Whereas the problem is that through ideological persuasion, through accepting some bits of Agenda 2030, but not others, subscribing to the climate change agenda, or conducting yourself as though you live in fear of coronavirus, all of these weaken the movement towards self-fulfillment. And we need to take responsibility to learn actually what's going on, because if everybody actually understood what was going on, the world would change tomorrow, just in a flash. But the problem is we are so blinded by ideology, media, advertising, culture, authority, and all the rest of it, that we can't begin to make sense of it. And this doesn't mean to say that you have to become an expert in everything, but you have to start looking much further than your own natural place or home in terms of information sources, people you talk to, news media, etc. Because they are only giving you one perspective, and it may make you feel comfortable, but it doesn't necessarily relate what is actually happening.
So, Maulana, Clive's made some, again, interesting points. We're coming to the conclusion of the program, so I'm just going to give both of you gentlemen a minute each to conclude. In terms of making a move towards a more ethical, a more moral, a more holistically balanced future, what are the absolute vital 2 or 3 steps that you would recommend either to governments or to the ordinary people? Maulana.
I wanted to say that it is not against advancement and science and technology, but the condition is we should not forget ethical limits and moral values. If we forget that, then there is no difference between us and others. Iran is one of the leading nation of technology. It has developed a lot, and it has many scientists and researchers, but they are not working in the direction like countries, unethical running their system. Their aim is to make the wealthier more wealthier and control the world. Their aim is wrong. Iran is aiming is to benefit the humanity and humankind from the technology and all these developments.
Sure. And Clive, coming back to you, then final word goes to you. What are the practical steps that ordinary souls can do to move towards a post-COVID-19 future, which is not just left to the greed and the profit and the consumption production narratives that we've seen by neoliberalism and hypermaterialist capitalism up to now? How do we get beyond that?
Well, I think the important thing to know is that whether this is by evolution or by design, what is happening is a trajectory towards greater concentration of power, the centralization of all power and control. And everything that we've looked at within critical thinking and beyond suggests that centralization is the key to our liberation. But we individually, as ourselves, have to make that mental leap towards realizing that we cannot abdicate responsibility to any other authority other than God, because God is universal law, and we must take responsibility for adhering to universal law or God's law. And if we adhere to God's law or universal law, then we will make the right decisions. But the first thing we need to do is actually understand the terrain on which we're walking, because what we see is an illusion. It is not reality. And it's our individual and collective responsibility to create a shared understanding of reality, because then reality will change.
Well, what a beautiful way to end it. La ilaha illallah actually is the negation of illusion and the affirmation of reality with a capital R, the reality of the divine. And the illusions are the false gods, the false idols, the false world that we buy into at the exclusion of the divine. Clive sounds definitely like he's kind of echoing those kind of, if you like, fundamental Abrahamic narratives that have been there from time immemorial. And it's something that we need to dwell on. Are we following the taghut, the idols, the false idols, which can be ideas, they can be celebrities, they can be movements, neoliberalism, they can be materialism? Or are we after reality, the divine reality, which is about really balance, simplicity, justice? That's a decision that Clive's certainly urging us to think much more deeply about, and not just blindly fall for whatever the moneylender masters are saying, because they certainly don't seem to be God-fearing or God-conscious, nor do they seem to be God-centric in any way, shape, or form. It's all about me, myself, and I, money for me, power for me, control for me. Is that an agenda that you as ordinary individuals should oppose? Well, I would argue that Al-Qaim, Al-Mahdi, would require that